Welcome to Rise and Relate with Rissa. I am back this week to continue the discussion of racial trauma. Racial trauma could be identified as the mental, emotional, and psychological injury that is the result of biases, discrimination, and racism. So I am back to discuss more in depth about racial trauma and hopefully provide some coping tools that is helpful and some other identifying things to look for within yourself. Whether you are just an individual outside of the field of social worker, also for social workers themselves, and to those families out there with younger children, because the signs of racial trauma could be identified as early as 12 years of age. So just starting back out and discussing what is racial trauma and what does it really do to you, because racial trauma could lead to debilitating symptoms, but as a culture, sometimes we can connect those symptoms back to other things like, hey, I'm just stressed out at work. Hey, I'm stressed out within my relationship. Hey, trauma. And as I mentioned to you guys last week, I thought my racial trauma was connected to my past trauma, not necessarily connecting it back to what I was experiencing on a day-to-day basis within the higher educational system and then within the work field. So for my social workers, I'm definitely going to hit on what my symptoms look like more in depth, and then I'm going to hit on the symptoms just in general. So for those that might be thinking that they're experiencing racial trauma, I can tell you that these things are indicators to look further into. So if you are experiencing just a negative mental thought process, that of course can lead to depression, it can lead to anxiety, hopelessness, a great deal of irritability that could lead to violent behavior. So these are more of the internal symptoms that you might have, but of course physical, because if you guys know anything about the human functional curve, and if you don't, please look it up. The human functional curve will show you what will happen when you constantly are under a state of chronic stress, what will happen to your body, which essentially will lead you to physical symptoms until it leads you to a mental breakdown, then will lead you to possible death. So physical tension could look like hypertension. It can be like the thickening of like your arteries or your heart rate constantly being elevated and going. It can, the physical, like I said, migraines. You can have really severe migraines and headaches. And a study that was done on racial trauma indicated that at least 60% of Black Americans will at least have one of those experiencing those symptoms due to racial discrimination in their lifetime. And when you experience racial trauma, because this is not something that is easily escaped, because we have to navigate the systems, even if you are not technically working within a white system, just the schooling systems, the housing systems, your community, you can still endure these things by proxy because of the policy, the regulations, you can still experience it through just those structural things. So it might not necessarily be interpersonal, which can happen more in person, like when you are at work, you can, in those kind of environments, it can happen. But on a more structural base, it could just happen through, like I said, policy. So if you realize that you are constantly like re-experiencing the same event, and it's not due to a singular traumatic event, which is more identified under PTSD, but it is re-experiencing the same distressing event because of discrimination from different encounters. That is something to look closely into. If you have hypervigilance and you notice that your body is constantly activated, which is another thing I've noticed in doing trauma work, is in order to survive a lot of dissociation and disconnection of our body happens. So this is a symptom that you might not quickly identify, but you should think about, where when you're under the state of stress in certain environments, around certain people, because of certain things, you start to experience like stomach aches, headaches, your heart starts to beat really, really fast. Then that might be an indication of racial stress, but it can also be a symptom of PTSD as well. If you are just hyper vigilant, you are constantly looking around, reading the room, constantly on edge, constantly evaluating the outcomes of situation, which then of course goes into anxiety, where you are essentially predicting what might happen. And it can be worst case scenario, and it's in a means to survive, or you have to constantly read the room and read people emotions in order to understand people's intents, and you're constantly just on awareness of what might happen, what will happen. And I'm going to give a great example of this in just a few seconds. Or if you find yourself avoiding. So did you guys know that your children, if your children ever dropped out of school, that it could be because of racial trauma? And them dropping out is the avoidance of the discrimination that they have received within the school system. So if you find yourself avoiding places, calling off from work more than you're used to, not wanting to engage with other people that are outside of your race, not wanting to go to predominantly white spaces because you have to deal with them, not wanting to go to meetings, whatever the case might be. If you find yourself avoiding, that can also be another symptom of racial trauma. And I'm going to use the example of the progression of my racial trauma and kind of the peak of my racial trauma within the social work field. And other social workers that are out there, if you've experienced this, if you have a story, if you know about this and you can speak more onto it, I would love to hear your story and what has happened and how you navigated and what you did. But I'm going to just share my experience of, like I said, the height of my racial trauma, which was in about 2019. I started working for Catholic charities, and I was one of a few black therapists that was there. And the majority of our population was black children, black adults, and I mean at least 68 to 70% was at least black children and black families. So when I started this job, it was only, I remember having one black supervisor. It was one black supervisor, but she wasn't a supervisor over me, but she was within a leadership position. And I had a supervisor because those that are social workers, you understand that when you go and do agency work, you have to work a certain amount of hours in order to earn hours towards your independent license to become a licensed clinical social worker. So that's what I was doing when I started this position. And my first supervisor was a white woman, and she used to constantly email me. Like, you guys, I'm not joking. I remember one time counting how many emails she emailed me, 8 to 10 times a day, with corrections to my notes, to feedback about clients, to housekeeping things. She just used to be on my tail. And I remember one day coming to supervision, and I was 5 minutes late. And she was like, it's really important that you come on time because these are documented, and you cannot be late because I can only account for the time that you are actually here. in this moment, by this time, like I said, I told you guys back in college where I started to notice, racial discrimination and, being passed up for opportunities and just experiencing racial discrimination across the sector. So by this time, I'm pretty aware of if someone is racially discriminated against me. It's just the means of how do I prove it? How do I show it? And how do I get help with it? So I remember having another session with a white girl and her, and it was a group supervision session. And during this session, the white girl was late. She didn't say anything about it. She did not comment on it. And I remember talking to the white girl after the session and asking her, what was her working relationship like? Hey, did she email you about these things? And she told me, like, no, she don't. Like, she emailed me once a week with new referrals or just feedback from her notes, but that was as far as it went. So it was very clear that not only did my supervisor not have culturally competent training on how to supervise people of other race backgrounds, but something about my presence threatened her. So I worked this job for about 11 months, and I came in and I worked as, like I said, I was one of the very few black therapists, but I worked at their homeless shelter in Fort Meade, Maryland, at Sarah's House, which is like I said, a homeless shelter. I worked there and I ran a phenomenal therapy program. I created the behavioral health program there where people came for housing needs, wraparound type services, but I made it a culture to come and get mental health treatment, because if anybody knows anything about homelessness, first off, it's a generational thing. So if your mom is homeless, you're more likely to be homeless. If your parents were on substance use, you are more likely to be on substance use and then deal with the same consequences that your parents deal with, which was homelessness. So I figured if I can work through the root of the trauma, the unhealed grief, and I can work through these generational things, I can help clients from continuing the cycle of homelessness. And that's what I did. I did group every single day. I created a program where they got great benefits for coming to therapy at least 3 times a month. It was all voluntary, and it was always up to them. But I was a woman of my word. I stood on whatever I said I was going to do for the client, I did for the client. Whatever I said I was going to follow through, I followed through on it. But I created a culture, meaning that when people came into that homeless shelter, they was like, hey, did you go to group? Because we're going to group. So I created this environment. And with that being said, in the 13 years of a therapist being placed at this homeless shelter, I was the first therapist in 13 years to get the productivity as high as it was, and to get the retention of clients as high as it was in the last 13 years of a therapist being placed at in that role. So I was getting recognized by the staff, by the superiors for the work that I was doing. They literally applied for grants, 50K plus, on behalf of the numbers that I was able to maintain while I was in position. And then came the George Floyd situation. And I remember, you guys, I have a white supervisor. And at the time, I had got switched to another supervisor. She was white too. I got switched to another supervisor, and I raised question and concern around, why am I watching my people get killed by the hands of police officers? Why am I watching people die it felt like it was happening every week. Why is there a whole movement happening? And at this time, there was protests happening in Baltimore where, there was riots. It was a lot happening. But why did not one of my supervisors, because at this time I had three. I had a group supervisor, an individual supervisor, and then a supervisor that was just a supervisor of me over the homeless shelter. Why did not one of my white supervisors come and ask me, how am I doing? How is my clients doing? And remember, you guys, my clients at least 60, low 70% African American Black clients. No one gave me support. So as soon as I raised that question, I started to experience severe backlash, retaliation, intimidation, and the discrimination I thought that I was experiencing before this experience was heightened to the utmost. And it led, this job in general led to 3 ER visits within that 11 months that I worked at that job. It led to me going to a sleep specialist because I couldn't sleep whatsoever. I had insomnia. My heart used to beat nonstop. Like, I was constantly stressed. I was under chronic stress at this point. I had chronic fatigue. I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue because I was constantly very sleep deprived. I was very tired. I had high levels of depression, anxiety, and I had to wake up every day and show up for my clients, in which I did. I put me aside every day that I can recount the days spent at this agency to show up for my clients in the way that I did. Smiling all, work done, because in the field of social work, that racial discrimination is embedded within the way they pressure you to do no's, the way they pressure you when it comes to doing CPS reports, the way they pressure you to respond to clients, the way, like, it's this underlying and undertone pressure that is happening to you at all times. So you are constantly in a state of, I need to perform, and I can't make mistakes. And I will go into meetings, again, me and maybe one other Black therapist, and then everybody else is white. And I would just notice that I'm shaking my leg and my heart is beating fast. And I'm like, what is happening to me? Because at this point, I'm having really bad, severe physical symptoms. And I finally was like, Marissa, you are enduring racial trauma. And again, I knew it by this time. I mean, I knew it. Of course, I knew it because I remember documenting my experiences and writing down timestamps and printing out emails. So I knew it was happening. But in the depths of it, I continued to show up in this job knowing it did not serve me because it was happening so, in such a subtle way. And because on the day-to-day operations, I was being recognized and getting awards and I was doing great work, I continued to stay in this harmful environment. And then when I sent that email is when everything was then outwardly. That outwardly racism started to happen to the point that I intimidated them so bad, they wanted me out so fast, out that job. They wanted me out because I asked the question. And I mean, it's as simple as it gets is, why did I not receive their support? And there is a host of consequences and a snowball effect that happened from there. But the point of this story is to highlight what that job did to me even before that event happened, that I finally, like, after a month of sending that email, I was out the door. And probably, I don't even think it was a month. I think it was a little longer, maybe 2, maybe 3. I don't quite remember because it was a traumatizing experience. It was very traumatizing. And it had lasting effects on me when I moved on to my next position, to the point that I was like, I don't want to work for no company that didn't have a Black executive board, that didn't have Black therapists. I was avoiding like certain environments, I was very hyper vigilant. I was very cautious in my word and in my language. I was very cautious in what I emailed and what I put in writing. I was very cautious in my documentation. So that racial impact. Now, if you're black, I mean, you probably experienced it your whole entire life. But that impact lasted until, I mean, truly, I mean, I can honestly say it still happens now. But I live such a different quality of life that I don't experience half of those. I don't experience most of those symptoms anymore at all because of the life that I live now. And it's not until I'm in certain spaces and certain things happen that, I can have triggers to it. But it took me 3 years to finally get back to what I can say was a normal space of being a social worker, being a therapist. And even then, getting back, I won't even say to a normal space, because I can still tell you in 2024, I'm not 100% back at the capacity that I had for the work that I do. So those effects not only affect you right then and there, but they affect you long term. And and in the midst of this, I developed high blood pressure at 25. 25 high blood pressure, you guys. Mind you, healthy, working out, doing everything that the doctors say. Healthy food regimen, like everything. But I was under so much stress because of that trauma. So if anybody else within a social work field that can identify with it, and again, want to speak on it and how you dealt with it and what you did, please feel free to reach out to me and email me at riseandrelatepodcast@gmail.com to schedule a time for us to have this real discussion, because this is real. And just like a lot of things that we endure, we just learn how to cope and navigate it. And sometimes in those very moments, we can know it's happening, but not to the full effect. And I will one day explain, just that abuse or those things that happen to us, because essentially it's like the same job that was empowering me was the same job that was disempowering me in many different ways and different aspects. So you get conflicted in what's really happening here until you have these physical symptoms that are non-negotiable, and you can't run from them and you can't deny them. But what I did to cope with it was, of course, I left that position. I put myself in environments around people that accepted and loved and valued me. I went and continued therapy. I took on jobs that in positions that did not stunt what I was born to do on this earth and what I was born to do within this field. And I continue to work on just my self-esteem and my self-care until I was back into a place that I can do things like talk about it and have this podcast and share this story and educate people on it. So other ways outside of what I did, other ways that you can cope and heal from it is connecting with friends who are engaged in racially conscious conversations and willing to help you process your thoughts and your emotions. Because again, Black people or your people, all skin folk is not your kinfolk, meaning that all people don't even know that they're being abused, don't even know they're going through racial trauma. So they might also gaslight you too. Because that one Black supervisor I told you guys about that was in leadership, I remember her telling me oh yeah, this is normal. 50 hours a week, 30, 40 clients a week, that's normal. And you can get used to it. And I'm like, huh? To promote that abuse and that kind of work ethic is so unhealthy. But that came from a Black woman's mouth that, hey, what I was feeling and the way I was working and all the clients that I was seeing was normal. So guess what I do? I normalize it, right? So just finding people, groups of women or friends that you feel safe enough to have these discussions with. being able to engage in prayer and mindfulness and spiritual practices, however you choose to practice within your spiritual realm, using positive affirmation and different mantras to just help you persevere and get through things and remind yourself of your worthiness and your value that you have. Practicing real self-care, meaning whatever that looks like for you. Some people, it could be cleaning your whole house. It could be shopping. It could be reading books. It can be listening to certain music, whatever that might be, engaging in your self-care. Learning to be aware and recognize the symptoms of racial trauma. If you have any of those things I talked about, whether it's from my personal story or from the list that I just gave you guys outright, being aware of that, making a list of situations, people, or places that can trigger symptoms of your trauma. So understanding that, like, hey, if I take on this position, especially in the social work field, if I work under certain leadership, or if I work in certain environments, if I'm around certain people, it will trigger activation within my system. And is that the most healthiest job to take on? Is that the most healthiest conference to attend? Is that the training I want to do? So being aware of those spaces, those people, those places that might not truly be conducive to your well-being and really empower you in a way that's authentic and is real. Recognize when you are not able to perform because of those symptoms. These symptoms can be debilitating. Like I said, I couldn't write emails. It was hard for me to speak. I would literally go offline. I would forget what I wanted to say. I will talk in circles. I was just confused sometimes when it came to pushing through and having to respond and perform in this capacity because of the symptoms that I was enduring. Role play how to respond to negative racial encounters with people that you trust within your network, within your group. Knowing how to stand in confidence to advocate for yourself. So being able to recognize the signs, but then being able to hold people accountable for doing the damaging work. And since we are such in an era of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, this is the perfect time to, hey, stand in it and hold people accountable for the cultures, the organizational cultures that are toxic and unhealthy to people of marginalized groups. Another thing is engage in activist work. So if you have a local NSAW, National Association of Social Workers, if you have a Black Association of Social Workers, engaging in community organizations that is all about doing anti-racist and anti-discriminatory work so that you can help self-advocate for yourself, but for others, to advocate for them in leadership role and within the school systems to help them build self-esteem and to be aware of these behaviors as well and these symptoms. And realize that racism will be here. It will be here. So understanding truly how do you plan to navigate it in these spaces. And that's why that role play is so important, because it's something that you cannot avoid unless you decide to assimilate to the white narrative, become one of them in the way that you behave and you think, to the point that it does not harm you. But it might not harm you right then and there, but the effects is still the effects, whether you are conscious of it or not. Being aware of that, so that you don't then pass that down to your children, your family, your friends, or those racist comments and feedback. You don't pass that down, but you're actually aware that practicing in that way is very harmful to your people. When you think about them, especially when you are a Black person in a position of power and you have certain executive positions and you can elevate and understand why a Black person in your company is not performing at the highest level because of the environment. But if you don't do that work, if you don't understand racial trauma, you will be the very person that will forward racial trauma onto them. So, as always, you guys, follow subscribe, come back for more, and let's continue to have these real and hard discussions.